When we look at the book of Acts, we notice how that repeatedly Paul is opposed as he preaches the gospel. Not only opposed, but persecuted and beaten and imprisoned. In fact, we read about two periods of 2 years when he was either in prison at Caesarea or under house arrest at Rome. However, it is in today's reading from 2 Corinthians chapter 11 that we get a fuller picture of how much he suffered in verses 21 to 27, which we're going to read. Howbeit, whereinsoever any is bold, I speak foolishly, I am bold also. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool, I am more. In labours more abundant, and stripes above measure, and prisons more frequent, and deaths oft. Of the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one. Thrice was I beaten with rods. Once was I stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I have been in the deep. In journeyings often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils by mine own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. People can be very proud of things that anyone might be proud of. Their titles, their connections, their wealth and possessions. But few people would boast about things that most people would complain about or even be embarrassed about. That's what makes Paul's boasting quite different. Although he reluctantly begins to engage in boasting, it's interesting to see that he quickly moves from boasting about things that people might be proud of in verses 22 to 23 to the exertions and trials that he experienced in verses 24 to 29 to things that most people would consider to be weaknesses in verses 30 to 33. There's a sense in which he turns this whole boasting thing on its head. Now, Paul begins with 3 features that refer to his Jewish links. He had, in every sense, impeccable credentials in terms of Judaism. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. Verse 22. By stating so am I up front, it suggests that the false apostles made much of this kind of thing. The 4th item relates to his Christian credentials. Are they ministers of Christ? Verse 23. However, this time he does not say, so am I, because they weren't ministers of Christ. He says, I am more in verse 23, making the point clearly that he is what they were not. And he demonstrates that by writing about things that they would not have been able to boast about and would, in all probability, not have wanted to boast about. So as Paul begins to outline the trials of being an apostle, it is notable that he describes them with these words: more abundant, above measure, more frequent, and oft or often in verse 23. This was the fulfillment of what the Spirit of God had told him. Bonds and afflictions abide me. Acts chapter 20 verse 23. This was the experience of an apostle. It was absent in the case of the false apostles. Now, there are things recorded here that we know nothing about from elsewhere, even the book of Acts. There we read of one shipwreck in Acts 27. Here he writes, thrice I suffered shipwreck in verse 25. All, as far as time was concerned, before Acts 27. A night and a day have I been in the deep, verse 25, is one of a number of things that we wouldn't have known without these verses. In these verses, Paul is writing about the pattern of his life, not the exception, but the rule. There comes a great challenge to us from this record of trials. Just how willing are we to suffer for his sake? How willing am I to put all my effort into the service of the Lord?